Hey, deserving listeners, a lot of you have been asking me to go back in time and watch Tiffany and Ronald. I'm looking at my list here. And so I'm going to go back in time on 90 Day Fiancé and watch them start from the beginning. Let's see what happens. I'm going to react to it. My name is Dr. Kirk Honda. I'm a therapist and a professor. Let's see if anything of interest comes out of my face.
I found out 15 minutes before he was born that he was going to be born. I went through my whole pregnancy with no signs of pregnancy. I got my period every month. I had no belly, no kicking, no cravings, no morning sickness. So one would not assume that they're pregnant.
All right, so this might be hard to believe for some people, but it does happen. And there's been a lot of research into this because it is an interesting phenomenon. And a lot of people might be surprised by that. It's like, how could you possibly not know you're pregnant, especially for people who have been pregnant? They're just like, how, especially in the last trimester, how could you possibly not know? I mean, there's so many different things that are happening in your body. How could you not notice at least one of the things? And it happens sometimes. Now, when we look into these cases, there's a lot that we can say. Of the cases where mothers will report this, where they will, the day of giving birth, suddenly now realize that they're pregnant. She said she realized 15 minutes before. So when we take all those cases together and we look into them, there seems to be a set of people who legitimately did not know, and they weren't suppressing any kind of knowledge of it. They weren't avoiding it in any way. It just seemed to not affect them and their life, and then boom, all of a sudden they're giving birth. But I would suspect that that's a minority of the cases. When we actually look into it, there's a fair amount of people who will admit, actually, you know what, I think I did kind of know, but I didn't want to be pregnant. And it was just so hard to accept that I just kept putting it off and putting it off. I just didn't want to deal with it. And I was going through a lot in my life, and I'd been traumatized earlier in my life. And I sort of learned how to disassociate myself from my life and to suppress my feelings and to just survive, get through the day. And whenever there would be some kind of sign or symptom of it, I'd just be like, no, I can't be pregnant. We could understand a psychological reason for that, right? For a lot of people, particularly people who are young and they weren't planning on being pregnant. So I imagine that's probably most of the people, and I think the research shows that most people who claim that they didn't know they were pregnant until the last minute will later on say, well, I kind of thought maybe at some point, but I was so afraid of that reality that I just quickly went on with my day. So I think that's a pretty big amount, a pretty big percentage of the people. We have the people who legitimately did not know. We had a pretty big group of people who saw the signs, but they were so psychologically scared of that reality that they just avoided it. And then I think there's a smaller group of people who actually are just flat out lying, that they absolutely did know, but there's various different reasons why you would lie. It's usually not the mother's fault. It's usually things that are happening to them from the outside, and they have reasons to lie to avoid abuse or some other kind of negative, unfair consequence to them. So I don't know what category she's in. She's claiming to be that first category where she legitimately had no idea and she had no psychological reasons to suppress it. And that can happen. So I don't know which one it is, but a lot of people, when they see this, I think, will say, oh, she's got to be lying or she's got to be stupid or something like that. And those are simplistic answers to complicated questions.
I had a gambling addiction, 2 years clean, thank you. But it was actually like a vicious circle. Every time turning, it started with the need for money. And I get a few bucks, let's say, for example, by my mother. And then I'm like, I need to make it more.
All right, this is interesting. We haven't seen this yet. He says that he suffered from gambling addiction and he has been sober for a long time. I'm guessing that means he's been in treatment and he might go to Gamblers Addicts Anonymous. I don't know. But he is speaking about it in a way that people in recovery will talk. He isn't seemingly ashamed of it. He admits it. He doesn't blame it on anything. And he's talking about how it was a vicious cycle. He's talking about the psychological compulsion of it all. So this is interesting. I'm curious what we'll find out.
I gamble, I lose. Now I need to make plan for more money. So what happens? I would steal stuff by my house and go and pawn my mother's stuff. My mother used to go on vacation and come back and her whole house is empty. And that was due to me.
So good. He's able to talk about it in a way that exhibits he has gone through recovery. When people first start their recovery process, they usually can't talk about it this plainly. So my guess is that he has gone to Gamblers Addiction Anonymous or some sort of treatment, because in those treatment programs, you learn to get used to the story, because avoiding the story and covering it up and being in denial of it actually will make you more likely to repeat it in the future. So, coming to terms with it yourself and then being able to describe it to other people in very plain language in ways that don't blame other people is a part of the process. You have to be humble. You have to admit you have a problem, and he isn't mincing any of his words. He's laying it all out there. I mean, that's pretty awful, right? That his mom would go on vacation, come home, and the whole house would be empty because he would have pawned everything so that he could gamble. And this is an addiction and a compulsion that we don't usually hear about or talk about, but it definitely afflicts a lot of people. A similar addiction, another behavioral compulsive behavior that we see that's pathological is shopping addiction or spending addiction. You'll see that as well. It's a similar issue that you might have seen in your personal life or on TV or something. But anyway, let's watch.
I got locked up for drinking and driving. I got locked up for speeding. And my mom locked me up for burglary.
Okay, so that's rough. So we're watching an interview from 7 months prior to the beginning of the season. 1 month after the interview, he relapsed and checked into rehab, and that happens. Relapse happens. I hope that in between rehab, he is going to Gamblers Anonymous to get the help that he needs. Sobriety in the beginning of recovery, which he's in the first couple years, first 5 years-ish is usually early recovery, and you need a lot of support to remain sober. And that usually means going to Gamblers Anonymous meetings often. So interesting. We'll see how he did after rehab.
So at that moment, I'm naive and I think, okay, it's over. But after I went home, it got so bad. It was just this vicious thing that took over him. And I knew that this man was not Ronald anymore. There's something much bigger going on.
So often addiction and compulsions come from trauma or relational trauma of some sort early in life. Usually it can just crop up randomly. In fact, sometimes medication or stroke, essentially changes to the brain, can spontaneously create compulsions like gambling compulsion. But often what it is a result of early trauma. And why would early trauma or life trauma create an addiction to gambling? Well, it's hard to say. We can't open up the brain and look inside and figure out what's wrong, but we do have associations and we do have conceptualizations that seem to ring true for people and will guide treatment. Sometimes, and I've seen this, is that people are neglected growing up or abused, but often it's neglect in my experience. I don't know, it's just anecdotal. So you have a young child who is neglected, and they're in a state of anxiety, and that becomes the norm for them because they're left alone too much to their own devices, and they have to fend for themselves. And then when they get older, they still have this underlying fear, this low, constant level of anxiety that will spike every now and then, but it's this general anxiety that is happening at all times. And the individual will look for ways unconsciously. Well, a better way to put it is the individual will do a lot of things just because life involves doing different things. And when they land on something, so they go gambling. And if you've ever gone gambling before, you're at the craps table or the blackjack table or something, or even slots. As you're doing it, you're really focused because you have money on the line, and so there's a lot of your brain becomes very focused on what you're doing because you need to pay attention. There's other people involved. There's money on the line, and especially if there are little things that you're supposed to keep track of, like I've got to count numbers, so I have to keep track of what number is hot right now. These kinds of things. Well, for some of those people who have that ongoing anxiety, during that moment when they're really focusing, they aren't feeling the anxiety anymore because so much of their attention is being pulled into this activity. And again, if you've ever gambled before and you're like me, when I've gambled before, I can't think about it. It's very anxiety provoking. So ironically, for those who have ongoing anxiety, the focus and the attention that gambling will give a little bit of anxiety, but the ongoing anxiety that they have will actually be forgotten for that time. And so the person unconsciously or even consciously will realize, wow, when I'm gambling, I feel so much better. The problem is that the gambling individual will have to do more and more and more of it, and they will get used to betting small bets. So then they've got to start betting more. The next week they go in, they bet the same amount, and it doesn't have the same rush. And so they have to bet twice as much, and then now they're paying attention again. But then they get used to betting that amount. And then they've got to bet more. Then they've got to seek other kinds of games out, other thrills to make themselves feel better. And they might not consciously understand why they're doing it. They only know that it just feels really good, and then it becomes this compulsion, this itch. And whenever they get away from it, in a similar way that if someone was using heroin or maybe cigarettes would be a better example. You smoke cigarettes for a month and then you just stop smoking. A lot of people would be like, where's my next cigarette? I need a cigarette. Well, it's similar with the gambling addiction. It's like you try to pull away. It's like, look, I don't have any money. I can't do this anymore. You try to pull away and you just have this itch. Just like, what if you did this? You got to get there. What if this is the day that you win? What if you pass up that one moment that you could just remember that one time a month ago when you really cashed in? That could happen again. You just have to use your system. And people have all these superstitions about winning sometimes. I don't know if Ronald has that issue. Is that his name? Ronald? Yeah. So we'll find out. But anyway, I wonder if we'll learn as to the basis of his addiction. I'm guessing we won't, but I'd be curious.
Because of it, got rid of all his things, got rid of his phone, and I wouldn't be able to contact him. No words I can tell you will really give you any sense of what I went through. He hit rock bottom. He checked himself into a rehab. Honestly.
So that's a really good sign that he checked himself in. That means that he is further down the road of recovery than he would be otherwise. I don't know what is before him, but in terms of the bumpy road ahead, I will say that he is leaving rehab and then he's getting married and he's going on a reality TV show, which could increase stress and thus make him more vulnerable to relapse. Most people would recommend, look, you're getting out of rehab, you got to get settled. You got to get into a routine. You got to have a sober lifestyle. You can't have a lot of stress in your life. Maybe you wait a couple years before you get married or go on a reality TV show. I don't know. Let's watch.
I'm gonna miss him a lot.
Daniel?
Yeah, Mom?
Man, Papi?
Yeah.
You gotta say bye to Malik for real, okay?
Okay. Bye, Malik. Bye-bye.
Oh, my goodness. Brings a tear to my eye. My wife has watched this season already. I told her I was going to be reacting to Tiffany and Ronald, and Stacy, my wife, was like, "Oh, Tiffany's son, he's so cute." And so now I know why she's been saying that. This is adorable. We don't usually see this kind of adorableness on this show. This is really sad. And, while I'm going to use this show as a jumping off point, when we move and we bring children with us, we sometimes think, they'll get over it. But sometimes it's really hard for them to leave. If you yourself were a child and you moved, you might be able to relate to that. You might not complain about it outwardly, but it's a huge loss. The way I like to put it is that if a child, 0 to 10, grew up in a particular house in a particular neighborhood, and they're moving away for the very first time in their life, they've lived their entire life in one spot with the same people. And so they don't know anything outside of that world. And when you put it that way, somehow it makes more sense that kids would have a hard time. But anyway, kid is definitely adorable.
It could lead to an alcohol problem. It could lead to a porn problem. It could lead to anything.
So good. I don't know who this person is. Maybe it's his counselor or his sponsor, but he is speaking the truth that often gambling addiction can morph, or any kind of compulsion can morph into another compulsive problem. And so the individual here is pointing that out. So it's good that they're having a talk about that. The reason why it's good is that for the two of them, they need to work together on helping him to remain sober. So when they're working together and they're on the same team and they know all the same things, they're much more likely to succeed.
Are no excessive drinking, no going to bars, no strippers, and I don't want Ronald spending any cash. I want everything that he does to be through a credit card. I want to make sure that I can see all his transactions, when, where, for what. You know, I need receipts.
So there's a rational reason for that. She is concerned about Ronald having another compulsive episode, and she's worried about that, and that makes sense. But to have her be the overfunctioner is not necessarily a long-term solution. It makes sense that she's worried. It makes sense that she would want to have some rules. I don't know if I included that, but she says, I have rules now. He's not supposed to drink. He's not supposed to. And the best case scenario is for Ronald to be in charge of his own recovery process, that he has rules for himself, not rules imposed on him from the outside. So we're not off to a great start. I get where she's coming from, but what they both need is a professional helping them through this process. Now, I don't know if I showed this clip either, but he's going to go to a bachelor party the day after he got out of recovery center, rehab. I think it was for a month. And he doesn't have a problem with alcohol, apparently, according to what we've seen thus far. He has a problem with gambling. So what's wrong with going out and having some drinks? Well, in early recovery, when you are in recovery of anything and you add alcohol to the situation, then you are asking for trouble. If you are in early recovery from heroin addiction or from cocaine addiction or cigarette addiction, and you drink alcohol, then your defenses go down and you're much more likely to relapse.
You go and explain to Tiffany.
No.
Yes.
No.
Well, I promised Tiffany that we would not go to a bar, and Carl also promised, but it's a South African tradition,
I take a single drink. I'm a single spice gold, eh?
so I just had to cooperate just to get it over and done.
So this is part of recovery. Now, I don't know. Maybe for him, alcohol is not a risk for him. Maybe he can drink and everything's fine and it won't increase his risk of relapse. It seems unlikely, but it's possible. And I'm hearing that he is saying that, well, I promised my fiance that I wouldn't go to a bar. So that's a problem right there. And I talked about that earlier, is it should be his rules, not his wife's rules for him. He needs to have his own system of recovery that his wife participates in, not the other way around. So if alcohol isn't a risk, then he needs to tell his wife, look, alcohol is not a risk. Or he needs to realize that alcohol is a risk for him and he needs to impose the rule on himself. The other thing we're seeing is that he is going to this bar, and at least I think for Ronald, he is saying alcohol is a risk factor. And his friends are not obeying that. They're not going along with it. One, because he's not saying this is my rule. He's saying this is my wife's rule on me. And two, because they probably just don't understand. A lot of people don't. And one of the things that you need to do when you're going through recovery, a major thing, is you need to tell everyone around you, look, life is different now. I am not who I was before. If I'm going to be sober, everything has to be different, including my friendships, and you have to respect that. And if you're not going to respect it, then I can't be friends with you. I can't have a destructive element in my life, which means the following things need to happen. I need to stay away from gambling. I need to stay away from alcohol, at least for a while, to make sure that I'm okay. And if you're not cool with that, and if you're not going to play along, then c'est la vie, buddy, because sobriety and my life and my family is more, these things are more important to me than my friendship with you. Plus, if you can't respect that, then you're not a real friend. And that's a really hard thing for people to do when they're going through recovery. And it's usually one of the late things that they will do. A lot of people make a lot of sacrifices for their sobriety, but this is one that people will really resist because we don't want to be rejected by our friends. We want to retain our friendships. But it's very important that you establish that among your friends. And that often means some friends have to go, particularly people who are still in the throes of addiction, because they're not going to really understand, and they might want to pull you back in to their lifestyle. They might be in denial of their own problem and thus in denial of your problem. Your sobriety might even threaten them. I've seen that before. So this isn't promising. But, maybe alcohol isn't a risk for him. I just don't know yet.
Imagine what I'm feeling when I learn that you're breaking promises. One day out of rehab. With everything I've been through because of his gambling addiction, trust is our biggest issue. So it just felt like a complete slap in the face, since I did tell him exactly what I didn't want to happen, and that's exactly what happened.
Right. So that is going to be a huge violation of trust. She made him promise that he wouldn't go to a bar and that he wouldn't have strippers, and that is what happened. That's a really tough situation for Ronald to be in. He's supposed to be like, so 15 of my friends are here, and I'm just supposed to walk out. Maybe I'll just try to make do, which seems like what he tried to do. It's like, okay, I'll drink, but I'll try not to drink that much. Oh, great. They're making me sit down in a chair. Am I supposed to be this huge party pooper and say like, no? Now, I'm guessing some of you are saying, yes, that's exactly what you're supposed to say. You're supposed to say, no, I promised my wife I wouldn't do this, and you're going against it. And that's a tough situation to be in, though. So, it's not as if Ronald set out to break the rules. In some ways, he was sort of coerced into it, you could say. Now, again, he could have walked away at any time, and she has every reason to be upset. Now, what they should have done up front is Ronald should have said, look, honey, I don't want to go to a bar, and I don't want to have a stripper, but my friends are kind of devious, and I'm not really quite sure what they're going to do. So, if they put me in a situation where I can't get out of it, like I'm just going to be honest with you. I don't know what's going to happen. If he would have said something like that up front, then they could have had a conversation, but that isn't what he said. What he said was, yes, I promise you these things will not happen. And that, of course, is a promise that he broke, and that is going to cause even more trust issues, which she, of course, has because of his lying and deception in the past. We haven't really heard about what happened in the past, how she interfaced with his gambling addiction, but we could imagine.
But then again, it was just a bachelor's.
To me, it's, okay, you're at a bar. Who's at that bar? Who can come drink with you? Who can maybe just make something click in your head that can go south? And it's not that I'm possessive and crazy. It's literally that you just have made a lot of choices.
So this is definitely not headed in the right direction. He needs to be in charge of his recovery. The way it seems, she's in charge of his recovery. And I get it. She wants to help, and she's probably right, but it needs to come from him. And this is a really hard thing for people in her position to restrain themselves from. They might even kind of know that they should stay out of it a little bit. But it's really hard not to. It's really easy to be sucked into someone like this in his life and to say, okay, you need to do this. And sometimes they even kind of want that. The person going through recovery wants someone to overfunction for them because it releases them of having to be responsible themselves, and it feels a little better to be taken care of in that way. But of course, an overfunctioning, underfunctioning dynamic does not last very long with satisfaction, because he will more and more feel like she's imposing rules on him, and that doesn't feel good, and he'll want to rebel, and he'll stop thinking about his own recovery and start thinking just mainly about getting out of her control. And she will feel more and more hurt that he isn't rising to the occasion and taking control of his own recovery, and that the dynamic will get worse and worse. I don't know if that'll happen, but right from the start, this does not show good signs. This has major red flags of that developing. So I'm worried about them, because for him and his gambling addiction, some pretty horrific things could happen. He could end up, so I didn't show these clips, but there were charges of burglary and other kinds of things that he was acquitted of, I believe, but were related to his gambling addiction, which the way he portrayed his gambling addiction, it definitely seems to have escalated to that level where in order to get money, he would have to commit crimes to get money so he could gamble it away. So if he relapses again, often it'll be even worse. That's what happens during relapses is people tend to relapse, and it's either right at the same level as they were before or even 10 times worse, and that could be really dire for him.
And that's kind of what bothered me the most. I'm like, did he know any of this? Would he decide, like, would he choose to still lie to me after all this? And then my mind spirals, because that's what it would be like if you were like starting to have a relapse, you know? You would lie to me again. You would hide things from me again.
So right now, she is exhibiting healthy communication, I think. She is taking ownership of her own feelings. She's talking from her own experience. She's not imposing rules on him. She's saying, if you were to relapse, this is what it would look like, is broken promises and lies to me. And that really, really scares me. That's okay. That's what you should stick with. Let the person going through recovery make their own choices. And this is a really fine line. It's really hard for people in Tiffany's position to navigate this, because on one hand, you deserve and should communicate how you're feeling, how the other person is impacting you. But crossing the line into control and overfunctioning is a subtle one and tempting one for a lot of people. And how do you know the difference between that? And it's just a somewhat impossible situation when you're in Tiffany's position. Because on one hand, you're like, look, in order for this to work, I have limits, I have boundaries, and here are my boundaries. And that's fine. But how do you not start becoming his mother and his drug and alcohol counselor, his gambling recovery counselor? I mean, how do you assert your boundaries and your needs without becoming controlling and without becoming responsible for the other person? It's a really subtle line, and it involves a certain level of distance, actually. The recommendation for people in Tiffany's position is to accept that he has no control over his addiction, and you really don't have control over his addiction, and thus you don't have any control over whether or not he harms you with his addiction. To feel like you do have control is just inviting suffering and creating a very strange world that doesn't reflect reality. You're running on a treadmill going nowhere when you're trying to stop a loved one from becoming problematic with their addiction. You'll be there, and you should be there, a part of their recovery, but it's in their hands. For Ronald, his recovery is in his hands. He has to be motivated to do it. And we don't know. Maybe he is motivated to do it, and the bachelor party really has nothing to do with it. But anyway, I'm just seeing a ton of red flags, which worries me.
Now, I won't let it happen again. You and Daniel are my life.
Building the trust with Tiffany is something that I wish I could get back like that, you know? If I would lose Tiffany, I'll lose everything I have.
All right, well, that does it for that episode. Everyone out there, please take care of yourself and take care of others, because we all deserve it. We really, really do.